Yeah, good morning. So welcome to another day of level 2 training. So I thought I'll give a small update of what's happening. So we are having around 58 candidates in level 1. We have around 4 candidates in level 2. One person is clearing level 1, so he'll be entering into level 2 very soon. And we have shared 3 job opportunities till now in level 1. All the 3 job opportunities are not for software programmers, so that is why it's being shared only in level 1. So if any of you are interested, you can apply. But of course, our desire is that all of you qualify for software programming line of career. So, but anyway, whenever my friends request for some candidates, I would like to share them with the group so that all can benefit. So this is a small background about what's happening, the progress that's happening right now. So let's start off today's session. Let's log into training.regula.com/software. So if you are watching this and you do not know what all this is, I would request you to watch all the previous videos and even the level 1 videos that are there. Watch all the previous videos and then you will know exactly what we are doing and where we are. So let's log into the project. So we were going to discuss on objects, and as I said, we are basically covering the theory part right now, and we will get into the so let me just start the session first. Yeah, so we are covering the theory part right now. So this is the content here. We are covering the theory part. So once we complete the theory part, just knowing the fundamentals or the basics of it or the concepts, then we will learn all these things with what is written on the right side. Okay, we will do a practicals of each of them with what is written on the right side. Okay, so now let us see what is objects and what is object oriented programming. So let's start off with today's class. Objects. So the concept of objects is the reason why it was introduced is because when programs were being made, software programs were being made, and the size of the software programs started increasing over a period of time. Initially, these software programs were shorter, they were easier to do. But over a period of time, the size of the software programs started increasing, and it became very difficult to write very large software with the kind of programming methodology that was there initially. So initially, the programming methodology that was available was called sequential programming or structural programming. That is, you write the code one below the other and the line one below the other, and based on that you run your code and you get your output. But what happened with that is if you are writing a software for a very large application, if you are writing software for a very large company, you would require to write thousands and lakhs of lines one below the other, and sometimes when you have to repeat a function, you cannot go back, you will have to once again write it below, so you may end up also repeating a lot of code in your software. So what has happened is, in the software field, the software programmers have slowly, or the programming language creators, they have slowly understood that it is important to have a structure in programming which utilizes a concept that is there in the world, which is there in the nature, and that's called objects. Now, what is objects? For example, um, so this is the mouse that I am having. Okay, this is the mouse that I am using for my computer. So this is an object. This mouse is an object. So this is the phone that I am using, and this is an object. This is the book that I am reading right now. So this is an object. So every thing, like I am also an object in a way. So every single thing is an object in the real world. In the same manner, in a software program also, you try to structure the program, or you try to create an architecture, or you try to conceptualize a software by keeping these objects in mind. Okay, so anything that you are trying to achieve in a software, you try to create them as objects. Okay, so if you want to, let us say, have a software for let's say an apartment. Okay, and in an apartment you would like to have a software that will take care of the maintenance in an apartment. Okay, so for example, because I am staying in an apartment, I'm just giving you an example. So let's say you want to write a software which will track all the maintenance aspects of a apartment. So in an apartment where there are many flats in an apartment, what all things can you have for maintenance? You can have lift maintenance, because if there is a lift in a large apartment, you will have to maintain that once in every 3 months or 6 months. So lift maintenance can be there. The other one is you can have sump maintenance. So sump would have its own maintenance, cleaning and all that. You can have overhead tank maintenance. I'm just giving you an example. So in this software itself, when you're talking about maintenance, we already spoke about 3 different types of maintenance. So lift, sump and overhead tank. So these 3 different items that we spoke about, in software we would like to treat them as objects. So we would like to treat lift as an object, sump as an object, and overhead tank as an object. And there would be more than one lift in an apartment. For example, in our apartment where we have around more than 260 houses, there are I think around 6 lifts that are there in different blocks. Sump, of course, we have a major sump, one big sump, and overhead tanks, of course, we have I think 5 or 6 overhead tanks that are there in different blocks. So what we would do is we would define each of these as an object. Okay, so an object called lift, we would define it as an object called lift. Okay, or an object called sump, or an object called overhead tank. And when we define it as this, we would give these certain parameters. Like for example, the lift would have the date of manufacturing. It would have warranty, that is when does its AMC or warranty get over, who is servicing it, what is the contact, what is the name of the company who is giving service, what is the name of the person, what is the phone number. So there are certain parameters that are there, and a lift would require checking of the electronics. It would require maybe greasing the gears that run on the top, which moves the lift up and down. So there are certain properties to a lift also. The same properties would not be applicable for a sump. For example, if you take a sump, you may not have something, some electronics in it which you need to keep checking. You may not have something to grease it regularly. Okay, same thing with overhead tank. What you have in overhead tank might not be what you have in sump. In sump, you may have challenges like if it is overflowing, you need to call the service who tries to remove some dirt and then take it away. Whereas in overhead tank, you will not have those kind of problems. You will have different type of problems. That is the valve working which ensures that the water is pumped in at the same time. So each object has its own properties and its own values, and that same concept is used inside a software also. And what happens is when you're writing that software, uh, you can repeat, you can use the same object or the same line of code or software. You can use it multiple times at multiple places. So for example, if I want to print this particular book, okay, let's say I want to print it again. Of course, I'm not supposed to be printing, I'm just giving you, let's say the publisher wants to print another book. So he will not go to the author and tell the author that I want to print it again. So let me just put reusability. Okay, I'm not sure if the spelling is correct or not, so but you can reuse it. So this author or this publisher rather, he will not go to the author and say, okay, see, you had given me, you had written down the entire book and given me for publishing. Now can you please giving me another whole book, write it and give it to me so that I can once again maybe print it or give it out to someone who wants to buy. Now if you, whatever I told you itself is so illogical, no one would do that. Okay, once the author has given the writing to the publisher with a soft copy can publish how many ever books they want. The same way in a software, when you think of wanting to reuse a particular code, okay, I used that particular line of code on the top, so if I want to use it at the bottom again, you should never be copying that and pasting it over here. You should not increase the number of lines by just copying and pasting the same thing that you want to use again and again. You are supposed to be using the same code by referring to it. Okay, you are supposed to go there and refer and come back. For example, let us say you want to service a lift, okay, and each lift has their own property. For example, in the block that I am staying, let us say it is a 6-passenger lift, and whereas in the block in another block in our apartment, maybe it is a 4-member lift. Okay, in our case, let's say it is 6-member lift. So what happens is the manual for a 4-member and a 6-member, there may be some similarities, but there can be some difference also in the manual, in the service manual. So if I want to service the lift, okay, I can keep the manual in my apartment near the lift, and I can keep the manual in the maintenance room in our apartment, or I can keep the manual in the company who is giving me the service, or I can keep the manual in every single house in this apartment and say, this is the lift maintenance, you please have it. Whenever we require, we'll come and take it from you. So you may think that all these things that I am saying is actually illogical. Most of it is illogical. Probably the most ideal thing to do will be either to keep one copy in the maintenance office, or keep one copy near the lift itself, somewhere near the lift on the side you have some room, you keep it there, and keep whenever required you come here, refer and go back. You would not want to copy it and keep it in every single place. You may think that it is increasing in efficiency, it would save time, but you're ending up wasting all the resources to reprint the manual and then keep it in different places. The same way in a software, when you're writing a piece of code, you will have to reuse it again and again, and we achieve that particular efficiency in code when we keep the software much shorter and much organized by using something called objects. Okay, so each object has some values. Okay, some values like lift has weight, passenger capacity, or maybe the number of floors it goes and comes. So those are all the values, and it also has some functions or something that it does. For example, in lift maintenance, you might want to check certain parameters every 3 months. Every 3 months you have to check certain parameters in the lift so that it is safe. Okay, so such things are kept inside some functions inside an object. So having said this, a small background on objects and object-oriented programming. I'll just probably open a what is object oriented programming. Now those of you who have already done Java, this is not tough at all. Java in fact works only with object oriented programming. Their entire structure itself is created in that way, whereas in PHP you have a choice. You have a choice whether you want to have it as an object or you just want to have it as a structural programming language or a sequential programming language. You have a complete choice. But in this course in level 2, I would like to introduce a little bit about object oriented programming, because it becomes very important and critical as you are building larger softwares. So we may not get too much in depth into object oriented programming, but we would be definitely covering some basic concepts of it, and we would also be using object oriented programming to achieve our programs and achieve the objectives that we have of creating software. Okay, so let's pick up W3 Schools has object oriented programming. So it is doing it in C++, but I would still open it because the concept is the same, whether it is object oriented in C++ or C, or of course C does not have object oriented programming. That's another thing. When C was introduced, it was introduced without this concept called object-oriented programming. And C++ is basically an introduction, it is basically C with object-oriented programming. Okay, so whether you use object-oriented programming in C++ or PHP or Java, the concept is the same. The way you do it may vary a little bit. So I'll read a little bit and explain what it is. OOP or OOP, also they call it, in programming language they call it OOP. So object oriented programming, procedural programming is about writing procedures or functions that perform operations on the data, while object oriented programming is about creating objects that contain both data and functions. Okay, object-oriented programming has several advantages over procedural programming. What we have seen till now is procedural programming, where you write one below the other. You just write in sequence. Object-oriented programming is faster and easier to execute. Object-oriented programming provides a clear structure for the program. What happens is, as I said, as the programs become bigger and bigger, as you're trying to make software for real world situations where it is very large, if you do not have an object-oriented approach, as I said, you will end up creating lakhs of lines of code, and it will become highly, very difficult for you to even track what is happening over where. Whereas if you have objects, if you have well-defined objects, let's say around 20 or 30 objects, it becomes very easy for you to go to the exact class, pick up the code from there, make a modification, and as soon as you make a modification there, the whole software which refers to that particular object or class, the whole software changes. That's the advantage that you get. Object-oriented programming helps to keep C++ code dry, don't repeat yourself. Of course, same thing with PHP, and makes the code easier to maintain, modify and debug, as I said. Object-oriented programming makes it possible to create full reusable applications with less code and shorter development time. Another advantage is once you create it, you can use it anywhere you want, and it's quite advantageous to do that. So that's a little background about objects, and we achieve that through classes, objects and classes. So let's continue, go ahead. Public static function. Okay, so let me. So we'll just have a small introduction to what is public static function. So these objects and these classes that we are discussing, the way you can access it in different places is by using something called public static functions. So how you do that is, and why you need to do that is, what happens is so when it comes to this, for example, let me use this particular page here. So you can define a class, okay, for telling the properties of a particular object. Okay, So for example, if you are saying a fruit, I am going with the example that is being mentioned here. Okay, so a fruit will have, let me open a notepad also. So let's say fruit is the object that you want to, fruit is an object. Okay, now in a software you will define an object by using something called a class. You will define the data and the properties, or the variable or the values and the functions, using something called a class. And typically a class is defined something like this. It just has a class and a class name. You have a class name here, you call it as class first, and then put a class name and open flower brackets and close flower brackets. So this is how you define a class. And usually on the top you write all the values, you put all the set of values, like you define a particular variable is 5, you define another variable is with some other string value, and all that you put on the top. And below that you have all the functions. Okay, you have something like this, all the functions are put below that. You can have multiple functions below that. Now this is how typically an object or a function or a class looks like. Okay, now when you do this, when you define a particular class, as I told you, I'm only covering the concepts. We will get into the specific practicals later on once I cover the entire concept. Now these functions here, you can define them in different ways. What I mean by that is, you can call them as private, you can call them as public, and even among them you have something called static. So why these things, why it is defined in different ways, is basically to give it different levels of accessibility or security. So for example, if you define it as private, if you say that this particular function is private, what it means is that this particular function can be accessed only from inside the class. It cannot be accessed from other places, that is from rest of the software. You cannot access that particular function. Whereas if you define it as public, okay, if you define it as public, you will be able to access that in many other places. Now are there any other types of function? Probably there are, but in our programming, in our this particular level, we will be sticking only to function. Rather we will be sticking only to public. We will not be going to the private of it. Private type of function, simply because we are keeping it as simple as possible, and whatever we would be doing, we would be able to achieve it through public function. So that's why we're going to stick with this. Another thing that we are going to do is, we are also going to say that this particular function is a static function also. Now public static function, the advantage of doing static for a function is, you can access this particular function from anywhere in the software by referring to this class name and this function name directly. You can refer to them directly. So let's come here, public static. Okay, I'll explain to you a little more as to what I mean by that. What happens is, if you want to use this class name in some other place, the correct way to do that is, you have to first initialize this particular class name. There is something in object-oriented programming, classes or objects, you have to first initiate or initialize the particular class wherever you require. And once you have initialized that particular class, only then you can access what is there inside. And that too, you can access only those that are public. You cannot access those that are private. But the advantage of putting static is that you need not even initialize the class in another place. Now initialization, of course, you wouldn't understand because I've not explained about it. For example, how do I initialize this particular class in another location in the entire software? What I'll have to do is, of course, in PHP, this is how you write a variable, $. Let's say I call it as var or anything. I can call it anything. All I have to do is, I have to say new class name. That's the class name, and close it like this. Okay, so now what is happening is this entire class will get initialized into this particular variable. Okay, and this variable then would be called an object. Okay, this will be called an object. Now this is a class. You are initializing that with this new over here and putting this entire structure into var variable, and thus var becomes a, or the variable var becomes an object. Now this may become a little overwhelming for you, saying that what am I speaking? Initially that is how objects appear to be, but once you start using them, they are so powerful and they make your life so easy when it comes to programming, because it, as I said, it reduces the code a lot and it keeps everything organized in its own places, so that anytime you want to modify, you want to change, you can go to a specific place and change it, and the whole thing changes. For example, okay, to give you one more example, and then probably we'll close with that example. For example, let us say I am I want to build houses. Okay, I want to build a lot of houses, and I want to build house architecture design. I'm just searching for house architecture design. So let me open an image. Okay, so let's say for example this particular first house over here, I just opened the first one, and this is an architectural design. Okay, now this particular design, when it was first created, it first started in a person's mind. Okay, somebody thought that, okay, let me make something like this, let me create a balcony here, semi-opened, and put another protrusion here, another elevation structure over here, let me put lighting here. All this started off in a person's mind, and then what would he do after that? He or she would put it first on a paper. They would draw, they would put dimensions, they would put different features inside an house, and what they would be giving is a drawing. Okay, and this drawing, or maybe a set of drawings, is what will go into the hands of the civil engineer, the person who will be constructing the house. Now those drawings are called, or in a programming language they are called as a class. Now this class with a name has all the values and functions and all that.